Coming up on Omnivore, searching for research consensus on ultra-processed foods and studying the flavor and aroma characteristics of honey. This is Omnivore from the editors of Food Technology magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT membership. Connect with our diverse community and discover a world of new opportunities. Explore the benefits of membership at ift.org/membership.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. The NOVA classification system, which associates health outcomes based on the nature, extent, and purpose of various types of food processing, has been widely criticized among the food science community for oversimplifying a complex subject and neglecting to properly consider other factors like quality or nutritional value of ingredients, and generally for villainizing broad swaths of healthy, nutrient-dense foods. But University of Copenhagen nutrition scientist and researcher Susanne Bügel thinks it's time to give NOVA a fresh look, and she's leading a new international consensus-building initiative that she thinks will do just that. Food Technology's Julie Larson Bricher spoke with Bügel about the rationale behind her project and the impact she thinks consensus will have on the global food system.
So I read that story, I think, in October when you announced that University of Copenhagen was going to lead this 2-year research project aimed at developing the next generation of the NOVA classification. How did it come about? How did you get your team involved and set up collaboration with other people? But how did it come about? Where did this idea come from? And as a nutrition scientist, what interests you most about the project?
It was, of course, by coincidence. First of all, I have been interested in ultra-processed foods for some years because I have been working with transition, food and diet in relation to a transition towards a more plant-based or plant-rich diet. So we have been involved in a research project where we have looked at 4 different regions in Europe and 1 in Africa to see at which stage of transition these areas were. And Copenhagen was one of these. Copenhagen is kind of a model for a transition towards a more sustainable future because we are doing a lot of things in order to become more and more sustainable. There's a lot of programs that is going on at the same time. And in that project, and because of that, we also started looking into some of the plant-based alternatives to dairy in the first place, and meat will be hopefully something we'll look at also at some point. But when you're starting to look at these plant-based alternatives, it pops up that many of these plant-based alternatives are actually ultra-processed, or they consist of a lot of things that, with my background, I wouldn't consider them foods. If I were going vegan, I would make plant-based stuff at home from the raw material. But here you can go into shops, you can buy something looking like a burger, tasting like a burger, but it's only plant-based. And I think in order to drive the transition towards more plant-rich diets, on purpose I'm saying plant-rich because I don't think we should omit meat totally, but a more plant-rich diet also for many people would require that they have some easy alternatives. So I think we need these alternatives, and we need to work together with industry to figure out how can we do this in a way so that it's still healthy and not just a lot of chemicals put together. So that started actually my interest, and I also saw all these observational studies coming out showing that ultra-processed foods were bad for your health and everything was bad. So all these ultra-processed foods, they didn't distinguish between plant-rich or plant-based or meat-based. And then I had a meeting with one of the directors, CEOs of or managers at the Novo Nordisk Foundation about something entirely different. And then suddenly he says, what about ultra-processed foods? If we would like to initiate a new project looking into the classification system and updating it, who would you suggest could be leading that? And normally I'm pinpointing at all my colleagues, but this time I said, I think I would be the one. And he said, well, would you? Well, yes, I said, I would. At least I was teaching this topic different classes, and I have been interested in it, and just thought, how can we do something here? So then he said, well, we are trying to set up some kind of network, and we would like to do this, but we would like to collaborate with a university while doing it. And I said, well, I would be happy to be that partner, university partner. And then we decided maybe it was best that we are not collaborating, but that I am actually invited, or I was invited to make an application. So I made an application, and I have a colleague here, also a professor, who also was interested, and we decided that we could take this project together. And we applied for it, and we got the money for it, and we are now independent of the Novo Nordisk Foundation.
So what are some of the first steps you're taking in designing this 2-year Next-Gen Nova project?
I will establish a small core group who will have to describe what criteria do we want to use when picking or when choosing which experts to invite for the first meeting. And that is something that we're planning to do first thing in January. Sit down and talk about who should we invite. And therefore, I'm trying to look into all these emails I've received. What are people doing around the world to see if some of those people should actually be the invited experts as well. But we need to be very transparent. So because there's so many people out there who would like to participate, and I think we need to be very transparent and also be very communicative. So I intend also to have to establish monthly online seminars, newsletter, so that we are also telling people what's going on and what we're talking about, and asking also those who are not invited to give opinions. So, because we will have at least 2 workshops in Copenhagen. One, I hope, in the spring 25, and the next one within a year after that. So we can have a lot of opinions coming up after the first workshop if we share with the whole world.
Can you describe what the main criticisms are of the current NOVA classification regarding UPFs, and how does imprecision lead to misclassification that could affect public health recommendations or consumer perceptions?
Yeah, one of my biggest concerns are that some of the foods that we consider to be healthy and which have been claimed to be healthy by Danish authorities, actually now, if we are also putting claims about ultra-processing, they would be claimed now to be ultra-processed. One of the best examples, and everybody's using it, I think, is rye bread. Rye bread is a basic, stable food in Denmark. It has a very high content of fiber, and is one of the main reasons that the Danish people are eating lots of fibers. It's also ultra-processed if you buy it in the supermarket. If you go to your local bakery, it's not ultra-processed, only because they are putting additives that increase shelf life. So that is one concern. It is actually a healthy food that now becomes unhealthy because of a processing or because of an additive. Another reason is another food like potato chips, which is high salt, high fat, is not ultra-processed because it only contains potatoes, oil, salt, and that's it. I've heard people talking about ultra processed as being high salt, high fat, high sugar. But if that's the only things in that food, it's not ultra processed, because classification category 2 is those processed foods that you are actually allowed to use together with the raw material from category 1 in order to make something palatable and nice to eat. And that the category 2 is sugar, salt, fat, vinegar. So what gives taste to your foods. So you can make a food which is not categorized as ultra processed, but which is high in salt, sugar, and fat. And that is actually unhealthy. So this way of classification might misclassify unhealthy foods to become not UPF, and other foods which have a high nutritional value to become UPF, just because 1 or 2 additives, which have been claimed or have been looked at and have been decided this is not detrimental to health. One group of additives that have been talked about a lot is emulsifiers. Some emulsifiers is also a big group of compounds, and they have, as one group, being claimed for being detrimental to your gut microbiota, because they can interfere with the gut microbiota. But at the same time, one of the emulsifiers, lecithin, for example, which is a natural compound in many foods, is also claimed to be good for your gut health, because it protects your mucus. So we have some emulsifiers maybe that might be actually beneficial, and that's I think also a problem that we need to address. All of these additives, they are not all bad for you. Some of them are actually fibers. Some of them, like this one, is a natural compound that can actually also be beneficial. So if you take it as a pill, it's considered to be good. If you take it as a food additive, it's considered to be bad. So I think in the category 4, everything has been put together without distinguishing between what is good and what is bad. And I think we have to bite that and figure out what is actually healthy in this group and what is not healthy.
What role does collaboration among researchers play in the success of this potentially updated NOVA classification, and why is it important to include both supporters of the existing, right, and the updating of and the critics of the original version?
I think collaboration is extremely important because the topic is related to a lot of different expertises. Most researchers, although I'm saying I'm more generalist, but most researchers are focusing solely on their own area. So we as nutritionists are working with nutrition. What do we need in order to get sufficient nutrients? In toxicology, they're working with toxic substances. In food science, they're working also in different fields. But some of them are working with additives. Some of them are working with processing. And processing and formulation is also 2 different things that are being mixed up in this class 4. So in order to be able to cover all the different aspects of processing and formulation and nutrition, we also need experts in all these areas. I've just looked up the lecithin thing, but I am not, and I don't know anything about emulsifiers. I don't know anything about all these other kinds of additives, colors or whatever. So I think I wouldn't be able to do anything without having collaboration with people who can come in with their specific expertise. Related to the pros and cons of the UPF or the NOVA classification.
Well, it's been great talking with you today, Susanne. So I'm going to ask you one more final question. What excites you most about this update project to Nova classification, and what kind of impact do you think this kind of work could have on the food and nutrition science community, the global food system, industry, consumers?
Well, when I'm looking at all these observational studies that have been published, it looks very, very convincing that there's something about something in that pot, I call it, the category 4, that are detrimental to health. It's very, very convincing when you're looking at all these kinds of studies. But I can't accept that it's everything going into the same group of food. So my hope is that, because we can't stop eating, we can't stop people from wanting to have this more easy life where they don't have to have specific competences in the kitchen. We also need to feed people in the rest of the world who do not have the resources, the capacity, or even the foods. And most of the food we're using as food aids are actually ultra processed. All the baby foods are ultra processed. There's a lot of areas and a lot of people around the world who are depending on this. If we, on the other side, also want to become more sustainable within our food system, there's also a lot of side streams that we have to explore. We have to waste less and therefore reuse some foods that we today throw out. The side stream industry will also suffer a lot if we don't do anything about this. I hope that by coming up with some suggestions how to distinguish, then we can also work with the industry in order to diminish the processing techniques and the compounds that we are using for food production in a way that we provide more healthy foods for the world community, that we that this becomes better for public health in general, not only in my own very small nice country where everything works. So I hope that we can actually do good both for the consumers, for the global food system, because then we can also provide less fortunate with foods that are still healthy and safe. And of course, I hope that the industry and the policymakers will work together with us in order to ban those that are unhealthy and provide us with more healthy foods that can also help in the transition towards more sustainable food systems in general.
Susanne Bügel is professor and head of section for nutrition and health in the Department of Nutrition, Exercise, and Sports at the University of Copenhagen. Find out more about her project to update and reform Nova in the February issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment, but first, this word from our sponsor.
IFT is the convener of the global food system. As a member, you'll cultivate your professional network within our global community, stimulate new ideas with the latest research and trends, and accelerate your growth with expert training and resources. Why wait? Visit ift.org/membership to join IFT today.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Honey has been used as a sweetener for thousands of years, yet the mechanics of its sweetness have mostly been a mystery. Researchers at Michigan State University have been examining two aspects of honey. Just how measurably sweet is it, and how does its aroma affect taste perception? Food Technology's Kelly Hensel spoke with assistant professor and lead researcher Emily Mayhew about the findings, her plans for future honey studies, and how it all might help product developers reduce added sugar in formulations.
In my very limited experience as a home baker, I know that I can usually replace white sugar with honey. And it's usually at a lesser amount than you need. So you need less honey than you need white sugar in a recipe. So I'm wondering if the study that you worked on with your colleagues and your findings on the intrinsic sweetness of honey support that like knowledge that I have as a very bad baker.
Well, I can't comment on your baking ability, but that was really what motivated the study. There was this anecdotal conventional wisdom that you need less honey than sugar, but there was not documented data proving that you need less and telling us how much less you need. And so that was really the motivation for us is to run the study so that we can say to replace the sweetness of sugar, this is how much honey you need. And so the study we did used about 60 regular consumers, and we trained them a little bit on how to use an intensity scale to give reliable ratings of how much sweetness they're experiencing. And so we had them come in and they tasted either sugar dissolved in water or honey dissolved in water at a wide range of concentrations like you would find in foods or beverages. And so what we found is, yes, you need less honey than sugar, but it depends on the unit of measure. Maybe you use less than a cup of honey to replace a cup of sugar.
Yeah.
But honey is actually a lot more dense than granulated sugar. And I think that's a factor that is overlooked when we're thinking about these equivalencies. So because honey is this solution of sugars and water, actually a cup of honey has a lot more sugars in it than a cup of sugar. So what we found is that honey and sugar provide comparable sweetness per gram.
Okay.
So for equivalent unit of mass. But because honey is so much more dense than sugar, that actually means just to replace the sweetness of sugar, you would only need about 0.6 cups. So the caveat here is we're talking about replacing the sweetness, right? And we know that sugars do more for foods than just provide sweetness, especially in baking, right? They're providing structure, humectancy, shelf life extension, flavor and color development. So we're not talking about all those other functional roles, but just to match the sweetness, in this, simple water-based system. It's about 1-to-1 grams or about 60% of the volume.
And then you and your colleagues analyzed the aroma of honey and how that impacts its perceived sweetness. So what did you guys find when looking at its aroma?
Yeah, so we were really interested in how the aromas of honey might contribute to its sweetness because there is past research that had looked at the role of aromas in the sweetness of fruits.
Okay.
A lot of this work was done by this very active group at the University of Florida, and they found that aromas are really big contributors to the sweetness that we experience when we eat fruits. And so here, honey is a sweetener, but it also has an intrinsic aroma. And so we were curious, is the aroma of the honey contributing to that overall sweetness that we experience? And so what we did, I told you we had consumers who came in and rated the intensity of sweetness in these solutions. But we had them do that twice. So once they did it, just how you would regularly take a sip and then make their rating of sweetness intensity. But we had them make all those ratings again while they were wearing a nose clip.
Okay.
Which fully blocked their perception of the aromas that were in the honey. So they're only able to experience the sweetness from the sugar, so the tastants that were present in the honey. And so by making the ratings two ways, then we can compare the difference in sweetness that we get when our subjects are just experiencing sweetness from the sugars compared to the sweetness that they experience when they're tasting the sugars, but then also the aromas, contributing to the overall flavor of honey. And so what we found is that the honeys really significantly increase, the honey aromas significantly increase the sweetness that people experience from the honey. The percent increase in sweetness depends on the honey variety, and it depends on the concentration of sweetener that you added to the solution. But if you look at a concentration of 100 grams per liter, which is about the sweetness level of a Coke or a common soft drink.
Mhm.
We're seeing on the order of 23 to 43% increase in sweetness from the aromas. So it's really a meaningful increase in sweetness, comparing the sugars alone to the sugars plus aroma.
Oh, that is interesting. So, I mean, right there, it would seem that that's very valuable insights for any kind of scientist, food product developer that's working with replacing sugar with something that might be perceived as healthier, a little bit better for you, because it has all those other great compounds and, antioxidants and whatnot in it as well. So, what do you and your colleagues, I guess there's two questions here. What do you and your colleagues want to do next? Like, are you going to be doing some more studies? And if so, what are you looking at? The specific compounds? What are you guys hoping to learn?
Yeah, so we have 2 follow-up studies for which we've already collected data, and we're now in the process of writing up those results. So one follow-up looked more in an applied direction, right? So this study that we just published looked at the sweetness of sugar and honey in water, which is a great model system. It's kind of similar to sweetened beverages, but a lot of the foods and beverages that we sweeten are much more complex, right? And so we know there are going to be interactions between other tastants and aroma compounds that are present in those foods and beverages. The texture may impact the sweetness, the way that it's processed or cooked may impact the sweetness. And so we have one more applied study where we're using honey and sugar in real recipes, so foods and beverages. And we're looking at how that relative sweetness holds up in these different kind of real food systems. And so what we're seeing so far, this is not published yet, but we're seeing that aroma enhancement might be a little lower than it is in water. And I think that's to be expected because you're having more interactions of tastants and aroma. So the full aroma enhancement effect, and when you're just experiencing the flavor of honey, is going to be maybe a little bit muted.
Right.
And as you cook foods, you might also be losing some of those aromas just by heating them. A lot of aroma compounds are heat sensitive.
Right.
So that's one line of research. We want to provide a little more practical data that can be used in cooking and product development of how this sweetness ratio may change depending on the food.
Okay.
And then the second line of research is looking into more detail on these aroma compounds, right? So it's still kind of an open question. What makes an aroma sweet enhancing? Is it a learned association between the flavor and sweetness? Is it something specific about, certain molecules have this activity, or is it about the overall aroma percept that is sweet enhancing? And so we're looking to kind of deconstruct the honey aroma, looking at some individual aroma compounds that are abundant in these honeys that we characterized, and how much sweetness enhancing activity they have individually and in blends, to see if we can identify maybe some key compounds that are potent sweet enhancers that then could be used in formulated products to provide some of that same sweetness replacement without sugars.
Wow. That sounds so complicated.
Yeah.
First of all, how you even break that down and then conduct a study that will give you those answers. So
I think one real point of complexity in measuring honey is that its composition is not fixed.
Yeah.
Right? It is in some ways a living ingredient, right? It's influenced by the species of bees and the floral source and the weather that year. And so I think it can be a little intimidating to try to characterize honey because is the data that you collect on honey this year from one region and floral source going to represent honey writ large? So obviously we know that honey is variable. What we found, though, we did this research looking at 4 different floral sources, and the sweetness of honey was similar across these 4 floral sources. So we know there may be variation, and we looked at common varieties, so clover, wildflower, alfalfa, and orange blossom. So these are pretty widely available floral sources in North America. There certainly could be other types of honey that don't behave in the same way as the honeys that we characterized. But looking at these 4 common varieties, we saw a similar sweetness profile.
Yeah.
Regardless of floral source, although we do see differences in the aroma composition. So that kind of makes us curious too, whether there are, specific compounds that are important for aroma enhancement, or whether all of these honey aromas kind of cue that honey flavor.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe they all can, for that reason, provide that sweetness enhancement effect.
Wow. So I this sounds like there's a lot that you guys have just kind of started. I mean, you just scratched the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much more to learn. So I imagine just for a product developer interested in this kind of research at this stage, it may be too early to act on, but something to watch for sure, especially as you guys learn more about the individual compounds that could potentially then be extracted and utilized, hopefully, in finished goods. What would you tell, I guess, product developers out there that are interested in this kind of potential for honey or the compounds from honey being utilized as a sweetener?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I think we haven't fully solved this such that we can give universal advice. But we hope that product developers will start thinking about aroma as a tool to provide sweetness in foods. I think there's more and more evidence that aromas can make substantial impacts for the sweetness of products. And so if you are developing a product where the primary role that sugar is providing is sweetness, consider aroma as a partial sugar replacement strategy. And that could be done by adding honey directly to the formula, or, as you mentioned, looking at some of these specific aroma compounds that might be contributing to that sweetness enhancement effect, and then maybe formulating to incorporate more sweet enhancing aromas.
Joanne Slavin is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and served as a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. You can find her dialogue article titled "The Dietary Guidelines: What's Next?" in the February issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, IFT Membership. Satiate your hunger for knowledge, connection, and career growth with an IFT membership. Discover the benefits and activate yours at ift.org/membership.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.